The Prime Minister's trip around the world is almost over. He's on his way home from visits to India and the United States. But before he lands back on Australian soil, Anthony Albanese has stopped in Fiji to reassure our regional allies that the AUKUS submarine deal is in their interests as well as ours. Let's bring in Chief News Anchor Kieren Gilbert, travelling with the PM, joins us live from Fiji. Kieren, in the last hour, you probably missed it, busy travelling and gathering yourself there in Fiji, but Paul Keating's really unloaded, perhaps not unexpected on AUKUS. Well, not unexpected, but probably the vehemence of it is unexpected. You're saying it's the worst international decision by an Australian Labor government since the former Labor leader Billy Hughes sought to introduce conscription in World War I. How's that? And he's saying that he sent Anthony Albanese some advice, but Albanese brushed him. What do you make of all that? And is there any disquiet in the government about the way Keating's talking about AUKUS, or it doesn't faze them?
Well, it's probably a bit of both. I think there is disquiet, but I don't think it phases them is the truth of it, Andrew. And we did read it. It reverberated, I think, through the Prime Minister's aircraft there just behind me. But the fact is, and this is the view that's been put to me by cabinet ministers, is one that this is, as I say, from ministers in the cabinet who see this now as he was in government 27 years ago, that the world has changed. That's the first point. The second point, that it's all a bit sad, is the other word that was put to me. So, yes, it's certainly been noticed. Are they fazed by it? I don't think so, not too much. But as you mentioned, the Prime Minister here in Fiji, in Nadi, he's received the traditional Sevu Sevu welcome at the Black Rock military camp ahead of his first bilateral meeting with the new Fijian Prime Minister, Sitiveni Rabuka, where this issue will come up. I know the Prime Minister did speak with Prime Minister Rabuka before he arrived here. He's spoken to him in the last few days, one of dozens of calls to leaders in the region, including in the Pacific, that the Prime Minister has made, along with Penny Wong and Richard Marles. So they've really done the full court press with leaders across this region. This was, the Prime Minister said, had a couple of remarks after his welcome here in Nadi.
Australia is investing in our capability, but we're also investing in our relationships, and it's wonderful to be welcomed here by Prime Minister Rabuka here in Fiji.
More on Mr Keating's remarks with Assistant Defence Minister Matt Thistlethwaite joining me in a minute. But Kieren, how much have Anthony Albanese and Penny Wong been working to reassure our region about the AUKUS deal, bearing in mind the concerns of the Indonesian and Malaysian governments and concerns where you are in the Pacific?
They have been working overtime. It's been dozens and dozens of phone calls. The Indonesian President, leaders in the Pacific here, as you alluded to, Andrew, including Prime Minister Rabuka, and there is a bit of disquiet that they've got to try and ease those concerns and reiterate that this is not about nuclear weapons, this is about nuclear propulsion, and about transparency is the word that's being used. So they're trying to keep everything calm, not surprise anyone, but it's not just with those like-minded nations that we're seeing this approach. We know that DFAT has been briefing China, the Pentagon also confirming that the State Department has been briefing the Chinese authorities both in Beijing and in Washington. Have a look at these remarks from a Pentagon spokesman overnight.
Regarding engagements with the People's Republic of China, the State Department did do that, and I would refer you to them for the substance of that dialogue. I would, of course, highlight what you've heard often from Secretary Austin, which is that open communication between our two countries is important for risk management and for understanding what one another is thinking.
Australia has nuclear treaty obligations in the South Pacific too, Kieren. Is AUKUS entirely consistent with that?
Well, it is. That's the Nuclear-Free South Pacific Treaty, Rarotonga, that came into place in the mid-1980s. It's a hugely sensitive issue in the Pacific, Andrew, given the history of nuclear testing in this part of the world. So that is the context within which the Prime Minister is holding these talks today with Prime Minister Rabuka, that long-standing nuclear-free South Pacific Treaty, which Australia is a signatory to. But as Penny Wong has said in recent days, AUKUS is not about nuclear weapons, it's nuclear propulsion. Therefore, the government and the Prime Minister believe they are well and truly within the remit of the Treaty of Rarotonga, which, as I say, has been in place since the mid-1980s.
Now, since the government came to office, they've been intent, Kieren, on ensuring there's not a pseudo-Chinese takeover of the Pacific. Can we read something of that into this PM's visit to Fiji?
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of a long string of visits now since the election, led by Penny Wong. And, of course, the Prime Minister's met with many Pacific leaders. He was not going to pass this opportunity, given the sensitivities, the disquiet in the Pacific as well as Southeast Asia about AUKUS. He needs to reassure them, as China and the Chinese authorities are clearly trying to exploit some of that disquiet, and they will continue to do so. You've heard the comments from the Chinese spokesperson in Beijing talking about this being something that will worsen proliferation and so on, even though it doesn't include weapons. But the Chinese authorities will continue to try and use that as a wedge to try and leverage more influence in this region. The Prime Minister's trying to circumvent that.
And the PM tells us the Pacific countries are keen on the government's climate change approach. I imagine that will come up in talks with Prime Minister Rambuka today.
Yeah, no doubt. And they're in those talks now, those formal bilateral talks. It always does. This is the number one issue for Fiji. It's the number one issue for neighbouring Pacific islands. That is climate change. They see it as their number one threat, and it is their number one priority. It will be a serious issue again of conversation between the two leaders.
Kieren, thanks for your time there in Fiji. We'll talk to you shortly.
Thanks, Andrew.